Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some French sentiment cards. Spellbinders recently came out with a collection of international sentiments. I'm using the French ones today because it's the only one that I have a small understanding of. My limit to French is high school French, so I don't speak French. In general, I can understand a few words or whatnot. So there is also Spanish, German, and Italian in both the press plate as well as the die sets. So they're great for people that are looking for some international sentiments for their cards. I have the die set that I'm going to be using today as well as the BetterPress plate and die set. I'm starting off with the BetterPress plate and die, and I'm doing this on some black watercolor cardstock, and you can see that I don't have very good results, and I'm pretty sure it's because of the texture of the black cardstock. I did use my embossing powder tool on the cardstock here, and I stamped it with some VersaMark ink, and I want to emboss it with some white embossing powder. And I left this in here because I wanted to share that if you're having a problem with your embossing, even using embossing powder tool, it might just be the cardstock, because I do the same thing on some smooth cardstock right after this, and I have a much better result with the same steps. So I did try to clean it up by using a small brush, and then quickly realized that there was not a whole lot of space between the letters, so it was going to be really hard to clean it up. I did do my embossing. I'm going to reuse these pieces from this. I'm going to die cut them and I'm going to reuse them. I'm just going to put them on the back of the one that worked properly and use it to thicken that cardstock and give it a little bit more dimension. I really love the look of that bright white on the black though, so I really wanted to stick with that for these cards. For these cards, I'm kind of channeling my inner Yana Smacula. She loves using like bold, dark backgrounds, and I really love the look of her cards, and I wanted to try it out. I don't do a whole lot of cards with a dark background, so I wanted to play around with that here. And I really love the look of these sentiments, like I said, with that bright white on that black. So I lined up my dies for this, put some Best Ever craft tape on there to tape them in place. I always like to tape them in place just to make sure that that die isn't going to move on me. There's one die in this set, and it works with both press plates. So there's two press plates, one die, and I love when they do that. It makes it so much easier to have one die that cuts out multiple things than needing separate dies. And separate dies aren't necessarily a problem. I just really like the fact that this one die worked with both of those plates. So I'm pulling out my BetterPress again because those, I'm not happy with the result of them. There's a couple that probably could have been used, but I wanted to check and see if at this point it was me or the cardstock, and it ended up being the cardstock. So once again, went in with that embossing powder tool, inked my BetterPress with my VersaMark ink, put that clear plate on top of the base and run it back through my Platinum 6 machine. So the embossing ink, the VersaMark ink, gets transferred to that cardstock, and I'll be able to put my white embossing powder on there. And you can see as soon as I do that, I have a much better result. I don't have the splatters of white around it. I have much clearer sentiments, and I don't have to clean up these sentiments. I put the embossing powder back into the jar before embossing, and fortunately my heat tool is still nice and warm from doing the embossing of those first sentiments, so this one goes by so much easier. Once I have this embossed, I can use that die set once again to die cut those sentiments. It's really easy to line up those dies. I love the fact that you can see right through them. It makes it super, super easy to accomplish this. I also really love when sets like this create multiple sentiments at once. That way I have a bunch of sentiments in my stash ready to go if I need them, or if I'm in the middle of a card, I don't have to stop and make some sentiments. So it's nice to have a bunch of them ready to go waiting. And I always love having a variety of them as well. A variety of different colors of the embossing or the pressing, and a variety of different cardstock backgrounds. So once that first one is done, I can take that die off, position it over the second one, and easily die cut that. And you can see even at a little bit of a distance that there's a much better result with this set than with the first set. So a smoother cardstock definitely works a lot better when you're using embossing powder, especially something as bold as white embossing powder on a black background. So I said before, I'm going to reuse these sentiments that I'm not happy with. I'm just going to glue them behind the other sentiments, just give it a little bit more stability, a little bit more thickness. I might as well reuse it rather than waste it. So I have this background here that I created when I was doing my club cards for this month. They're using some magicals. This one is called Alexandra's Artists. I've used that scrap piece of background to die cut some flowers, and I'm using the Vivid Blooms die set. Thought I had taped assembling them, but I clearly hadn't when I went back over my footage. If you want to see the assembly of these dies, I have a Vivid Blooms die set or a Vivid Blooms video that I've already created. I will link that at the end of this video so that you can see those being assembled. Most of the floral dies that Spellbinders makes are very, very easy to assemble. There's not really anything complicated about them. So once they're assembled, it makes it easy to create your card. For my card base, I have black for my background here, and then I have a mat around it that is periwinkle cardstock. The mat is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4. My black piece, which is Onyx cardstock, is trimmed to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. So we have a nice mat behind there. I love the look of these florals on that black background. It's so striking, so I can see why Yana does this often. It's very satisfying to see those florals on there. I only use the magical background for the top layer of the card of the flowers that I am gluing down right now. I used it for this whole one here that I'm gluing for the center. So I don't have magicals on all of my flowers. I just have it on the largest ones. And even the side profile flowers, the background of them are die cut out of that periwinkle cardstock. So it's only the top layer of those florals that have it. But those magicals have a gorgeous shimmer to them. And I love using them with different things, especially with die cuts, because it gives it a really unique look. For finishing off my florals, I'm just using dots of stickles just to add a little bit of extra texture and sparkle. And then I glued down my sentiment over top of those florals there. I wanted to make sure that you could see that sentiment was on some black cardstock, and it's quite striking right on top of those florals. For my next card, I'm using My Heart Beats For You press plate. I'm using it on some black watercolor cardstock. I want to use those magicals over top of some VersaMark ink on a pressed background. So I'm putting that plate onto the base of the BetterPress, and then I am taking my watercolor cardstock and taping it to the clear plate. My piece of watercolor cardstock was just a little bit large there, so I needed to trim it down just a tiny little bit so that I could make sure that my image was centered in this piece of cardstock. Once again, I'm using Embossing Powder tool on my cardstock background. When I go and brush on my magicals, I want those magicals to really only stick to my VersaMark ink. So by putting that embossing powder tool on there, I can make sure that happens. I put the clear plate onto my base, run it through my Platinum 6 machine, and you really can't see the image on the video, but the image is there. You can see it in real life. I stick it to my sticky mat and then pick out the magicals that I want to use. Now, all the magical sets have 5 different colors in them. I'm just choosing 3 of them. So I'm choosing the jade, the azalea, and I can't remember what the purple color is called. I'm going to use my Perfect Pearls brush. This technique can easily be done with Perfect Pearls as well. Both the Perfect Pearls, the binding agent in them is activated with water. For the magicals, you also want to spray water on them to really get those colors to stick to that ink and basically stay there. So I used that Perfect Pearls brush, and I'm using the purple and the pink just to color different flowers. And then I'm going to be using the jade to color in all of my greenery. Now, these magicals aren't going to necessarily be as bright as they were on that white cardstock background. They're going to be a little bit more of a subtle background, but I really love the look that they give, and it's just a different way to do a background. So once I have my florals done, I'm going to use that jade, and I'm brushing it all over the different areas of my greenery that don't have the florals on them. The brush I said that I'm using is a Perfect Pearls brush. It's a nice fluffy brush. You don't necessarily have to use a Perfect Pearls brush, but I did want to use a fluffy brush to make sure that I could brush those that powder all the way around. Before misting it with water, I use a Swiffer duster cloth refill to pick up any leftover of the magical powders that isn't sticking to ink. And once that's cleaned off, I'm using my Mighty Mister just to mist it. It doesn't need to be super wet, but I do want to make sure that there's moisture on all of those powders. And that's why I used watercolor cardstock for that background, because regular cardstock really doesn't like that. For the image part of my card here, I'm using the Heart Hands die set. I have everything already die cut ready to go. I also have my sentiment die cut ready to go. For my sentiment, I'm using the French Sentiments die set, and I'm using the Je t'aime, which means I love you. And I have the shadow die cut out of that Magicals background, but I have the sentiment itself die cut with black cardstock. And I thought the having the Magicals background would play in with the Magicals that are on that background, on that press plate image, and tie into that. And it would also make it show up better on that background if I have the Magicals as the shadow and then the black as my sentiment. I'm using my Barely Art glue for gluing that sentiment down. I'm using it for everything, for gluing everything in this video. I love that with that fine tip bottle, it's really easy to glue down sentiments. You could do just dots of glue. I also use some reverse tweezers to hold that sentiment. That way I can place it exactly where I want it to go and my fingers don't get in the way. With those sentiments done, I put an acrylic block on there just to hold everything down nice and flat, make sure that nothing moves on me, and it frees up my hands to assemble the heart hands. I also use that Magicals background to die cut the bracelet for the heart hands, and then did the shadow in black. For the hands themselves, the shadow is in black, and the black here is Onyx Cardstock. And then my hands themselves are die cut out of some Barely Peach cardstock. So this is a fun one to create with. I've done another video where I've used it before when the collection came out. It's just a fun one. I think this one was a great one also to do for Valentine's cards, just something different, something unique. There's a tiny little pinky on each one of these hands that I just assemble or just add with by using a jewel picker. The piece is really, really tiny, and you can see exactly where it's supposed to go on the shadow part. There is a little outline that's left there. So I just put some glue on that shadow part and then use my jewel picker to place that die cut right in place. Once it's all assembled, I can also put my acrylic block on there to hold all of that in place. Once again, making sure that it stays nice and flat while everything's drying. For my background here, I'm trimming it down 1/4 of an inch from each side. So my finished size is 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And once again, I have that Periwinkle cardstock, Lilac Blossom cardstock that I'm using as my mat. And that Lilac Blossom cardstock is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I glue both of those down and then make sure that that has dried for a couple seconds before adding my hearts. Another nice thing about putting the acrylic block on top there is I can make sure that the design that I have in my head is going to work, or it's going to have the look that I want. Now, the funny thing here is I had intended to put that Je t'aime in the middle of the heart hands. In my mind, that die cut was smaller than it actually is. And when it came to putting it there, it just cluttered that whole center of the card. So I ended up just putting it on the bottom. Another option would have been to put one word at the top, one word at the bottom, or to put the sentiment on the inside of the card. So there's a few different ways that this could have been done. So aside from die cutting ahead of time, this card came together very quick and easy. The only thing you really had to wait for was the water to dry once you misted that Magicals background. But when you're waiting for it to dry, I'll often do some die cutting or something like that just to, utilize that time. The last step, I added a little bit of stickles in the center of those flowers and then set them aside to dry. For my last card, I'm just using some white watercolor cardstock for this one. I am going to use the Butterfly Bouquet press plate. I'm going to place that on the center of the inside part of the BetterPress system, taping that watercolor cardstock in place. Once again, using that embossing powder tool just to make sure that the embossing powder is only going to stick to the VersaMark ink. Putting the VersaMark ink on that BetterPress plate. And when I use that VersaMark ink pad, am very careful not to press it down onto the plate. I do it fairly lightly. I don't want to press that ink into the grooves of the press plate. I find that if you press that in, often that'll make not crisp lines when you're doing your better pressing, especially when you're watercoloring, or especially when you're embossing. By just putting the ink on the upper part of that press plate, I can make sure that I get some nice crisp images with my embossing. So the other pieces that I did black watercolor cardstock with white embossing powder. This one I'm doing white watercolor cardstock with black embossing powder. And again, it creates a really nice bold image. I'm going to do my watercoloring for this with those magicals. So those magical powders can be used in multiple ways. You can create a background with them. You can use them to dust over ink and then mist them. You can do emboss resist with them. So they're really fun to play with. And I love the fact that each one of them has like different crystal powders in them. So you get some really unique looks. They're really easy to use for watercolors as well. All I do is I open up my container, use my brush and the moisture from my brush to pick up a little bit of those powders, and then I brush them onto my glass surface to dissolve all of those powders before I start watercoloring. So for this particular image, I'm using 4 of the colors. The other one is called Marigold, but it turns out that it ends up being more of a brown color, and I'm using that for the branch or branches of this image. Now I'm using the purple, and I do the same technique with all of them. I use the moisture from my brush to pick up some of the powders and then put it on my desk to make sure that I dissolve them nicely. I want to make sure that I don't have any grit or crystals in my watercolor image. So I'm watercoloring the purple on the background flowers on the branches that I just colored with that brown color. And when I'm doing the watercoloring, I always start in the center of the base of the flowers where I want the color to be darkest. As you're doing the watercolor, there's going to be less color on your brush, so it's going to gradually get naturally a little bit lighter. The other thing that I like to do is I have a piece of paper towel to my right hand side, and I'll regularly remove color from my brush so that I have a little bit of control. I can also use with this brush, I can also squeeze that brush on top of the paper towel, and there's water in the handle. It flushes that brush out, so then I have a nice clean brush and easily can move to the next color. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so having a jar of water or a glass of water on my desk would be a disaster for me. So by doing it this way, it's nice and clean. I don't have to worry about possibly knocking into a glass of water and spilling it all over my surface. I've done that before. I like having a brush that has that water in there. It makes it nice and clean, nice and easy, and I don't have to worry about making a mess. I have 2 of these brushes. At one point I lent one to my daughter and I was worried about not getting it back because it is my favorite brush to use. So I ended up buying a second one, and I've never once regretted it. I've got my brush back. So I have 2 of them, and I swap between the 2 of them often. So for the large flowers, I'm coloring them with the pink color. I went over the whole thing first with a really, really light coat of that color. And then I put my brush back in the ink to get a little bit more color. And I'm just dotting that darker color at the base of the petals where I want the colors to be a little bit darker. Because that whole flower is still damp from that first coat, it's going to naturally blend and bleed. Once I've dotted all the color that I want, I can clean off the excess off my brush, and then I can use my clean brush to blend any of the areas that didn't blend as much as I want them to. So I have a lot of control when I do this. If I happen to get a little bit too much color where I don't necessarily want it, I can also go back in and with a clean brush, a clean damp brush, I can brush over top of where there's excess color, and I can remove some of that color. So you have a lot of control over it this way. For the leaves and the foliage, I'm going to use that jade color. Now it is a little bit more of a blue tone, but I didn't want to bring in something else to do the foliage. I wanted to keep it within the Magicals collection or the Magicals set that I was using. And I really love the different look. It's not something that I would normally do using like a bluey green for florals, but it's a really nice, unique look for something a little bit different. And I do the same technique with these as I do with my florals. I go in and do a one layer first, starting where I want the color to be darkest. Then if there's areas that I want to have more color in, I'll add more color to my brush and just dot them in those areas. And again, because that's still damp, it's going to naturally start to blend and bleed. And if by chance I have an area that has a bit too much color, I'll clean my brush off and just pull up that color. I let that dry completely, and then I'm using this new watercolor blending set or watercolor mixing set from Spellbinders. This has 3 different colors in it. There is a silver, a gold, and an indigo, and I'm going to use this to create some splatters for the background. So I use my Mighty Mister just to mist each one of those trays, just to dampen them a little bit, let them sit for a moment or two, and then use my Yasutomo brush to pick up that color and then splatter it. Now that silver, you can't see it on the camera, but you do see when you tilt that piece into the light, you do see some flecks of silver splatters. So I did it on a piece of black as well, because I wanted you to see what the colors look like on black, as well as the fact that you couldn't see the silver on camera. So I wanted you to see that there was color to it on that black. So I think it's going to be great for doing on dark backgrounds as well. Then I let that dry, that silver dry. I did it with the gold, let that dry, and then did it with the indigo. And the indigo, it looks black on the camera, but if you add water to it and thin it down, it has more of a blue tone to it. It's a really gorgeous color. Once that was completely dry, I took my piece and I trimmed it off so that it was 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I have a black mat here that is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So all of the mats and all of my image pieces for all of my cards for this video are all exactly the same size. I'm using that Barely Art glue to glue that whole piece together. I'll let that dry for a few moments and then pick my sentiment. And I wasn't sure if I wanted this to be an anniversary card or a sympathy card. I ended up going with a sympathy card, and I wanted to have a little bit of dimension on this card. So I grabbed some of my foam pop dots. I'm using the negative part of the foam pop dot here. Might as well use that and use it up. There's no point in it going to waste. I trimmed that to just a little bit narrower than my sentiment, and then cut that into a couple pieces to extend it along that whole piece and put it on there, taking both backings off so that it was sticky on both sides. Once that's done, I can add that to the front of my card, and it just gives a little bit of extra dimension. Now, I often will add stickles to my card for even more sparkle and more texture. I didn't do that with this one because with all of the Magicals watercoloring as well as the splatters, I thought it had enough texture to it, but you could easily add that to it if you wanted to add just a little bit more to it. I love the final result of it. It's simple, but it's beautiful. Then we have the Heart Hands Je T'aime card, and the back is interesting, but it doesn't overwhelm that entire card. It's subtle enough that the die cuts on the front are the focal point. And then that very first floral card with those bold florals on that background, and I definitely have to do cards with more dark backgrounds again. I really love the striking look of them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.